The rust-colored dust kicked up by Marcus Chen's beaten Ford pickup settled like a shroud over the desolate landscape, and for a moment he wondered if he'd finally lost what remained of his mind. The GPS had died 20 miles back, somewhere between the last gas station and nowhere, leaving him to navigate by instinct and a hand-drawn map from a real estate agent who'd looked at him like he was buying his own grave. "Well, Duke, this is it," Marcus said, his voice hoarse from the 3-day drive from Sacramento. The German shepherd in the passenger seat lifted his grizzled head, amber eyes reflecting the same weariness that had settled into Marcus's bones over the past 2 years. Both of them carried scars. Duke's from an IED explosion outside Kandahar, Marcus's from the same blast that had ended both their military careers and left them adrift in a civilian world that felt more foreign than Afghanistan ever had. The bunker squatted on the horizon like a concrete tumor, its entrance barely visible above ground level. 50 acres of Nevada wasteland stretched in every direction, punctuated only by Joshua trees that looked like the twisted arms of the damned reaching toward an indifferent sky. The seller had called it a Cold War relic with unlimited potential, but Marcus knew desperation when he heard it. The same desperation that had driven him to liquidate his disability settlement, his grandfather's watch, and every last dollar he'd saved during 15 years of military service. $12,000. That's what remained between him and homelessness, and he just spent it on a hole in the ground that most people would use for target practice. If this story has you hooked and you want to see where Marcus's desperate gamble leads, smash that like button and let me know in the comments. This kind of detailed storytelling takes real time and effort to craft, so your support means everything. The heavy steel door groaned as Marcus forced it open, the sound echoing through what felt like a tomb. Duke's ears flattened against his head, and Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that had become his constant companion since the doctors started using words like PTSD and adjustment disorder. The air inside tasted of rust and decades-old fear, but it was dry, and it was theirs. "Home sweet home," Marcus muttered, clicking on the military-grade flashlight that was one of the few things he'd kept from his service days. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow corridor that stretched deeper than the real estate listing had suggested. The walls were thick concrete, built to withstand nuclear winter, which seemed appropriate considering the nuclear winter of his own life. Duke padded beside him, the click of his nails on concrete creating a rhythm that reminded Marcus of marching cadences from a lifetime ago. The main living area opened up into something that might have once housed a family of Cold War paranoids, complete with bunks, a kitchen area, and what appeared to be an air filtration system that hummed with surprising vitality. "Power's still on," Marcus said, more to himself than to Duke. The electricity bill was supposedly current, another selling point that had seemed too good to be true. In his experience, things that seemed too good to be true usually were, but he'd been beyond caring about such details. He needed shelter, silence, and space to figure out what came next in a life that had lost all sense of direction. The first night, he lay on a military cot he'd brought from his storage unit, listening to the desert wind howl above ground as Duke pressed against his side. The familiar weight of his companion helped quiet the voices that had been growing louder in recent months, the voices of men who hadn't made it home, the echoes of explosions that had rearranged his entire world in a matter of seconds. It was during the third day, while exploring what he'd assumed was a supply closet, that Marcus first noticed the discrepancy. The bunker felt larger than its blueprint suggested, as if the space bent in ways that defied the simple mathematics of construction. He paced off the main area, then walked the exterior perimeter above ground, and the numbers didn't match, not even close. "What do you think, boy?" he asked Duke, who had been acting strangely since they'd arrived. The dog kept padding to specific spots on the floor and whining, his head cocked as if listening to sounds Marcus couldn't hear. It was behavior Marcus had seen before, in Afghanistan, when Duke would alert to buried explosives or hidden weapons caches. But this wasn't Afghanistan, and there shouldn't be anything buried here except the bunker itself. On the fourth night, the sound started. It was barely perceptible at first, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. Marcus lay perfectly still, controlling his breathing the way his therapist had taught him, trying to determine if the sound was real or another manifestation of his deteriorating mental state. But Duke heard it too, rising to his feet and padding to the eastern wall, where he pressed his ear against the concrete and whined. "Easy, boy," Marcus whispered, but his heart was already racing. The sound was mechanical, purposeful, like the heartbeat of something vast and hidden. It came in intervals, 3 beats, pause, 3 beats, pause, with the precision of a machine that had been running for decades without human oversight.
Marcus had learned to trust Duke's instincts more than his own. In the military, the dog had saved his life more times than he could count, alerting him to dangers that human senses couldn't detect. If Duke said something beneath their feet, then something was there. The next morning, Marcus began a systematic exploration of the bunker's construction, using skills he'd learned as a combat engineer. He measured walls, checked for hollow spaces, and examined every rivet and weld for signs of concealed openings. What he found made his hands shake with something that felt like hope for the first time in years. The eastern wall wasn't just thick, it was double thick, with a gap that suggested a hidden corridor. The construction was seamless, professional, designed by someone who understood that the most effective secrets were the ones that didn't look like secrets at all. Marcus ran his fingers along the concrete surface, feeling for the kind of concealed mechanism that paranoid government contractors might install in a facility that wasn't supposed to exist. "There's something here, isn't there?" he said to Duke, who had positioned himself directly in front of what appeared to be solid wall. The dog's tail wagged once, a controlled movement that Marcus had learned to interpret as confirmation. The breakthrough came when Marcus accidentally bumped into a support beam while carrying supplies. The impact triggered something, a soft click that seemed to come from within the wall itself. A section of concrete, perfectly camouflaged and expertly balanced, shifted inward by perhaps half an inch. It was so subtle that someone who wasn't looking for it would never notice, but to Marcus's trained eye, it might as well have been a neon sign. His hands found the hidden seam, and with steady pressure, a door-sized section of wall pivoted on concealed hinges. The air that rushed out was different, colder, carrying the scent of machinery and something else, something that made his pulse quicken with anticipation and dread. Beyond the hidden door lay a staircase that descended into absolute darkness, carved from living rock and lined with the same military-grade construction as the main bunker. Emergency lighting flickered to life as they crossed the threshold, activated by motion sensors that had been waiting decades for human presence. Duke pressed close to Marcus's side as they descended, both of them moving with the careful precision of soldiers entering potentially hostile territory. The staircase was longer than it should have been, dropping far below the level where any legitimate bunker would have any reason to extend. With each step, the mechanical heartbeat grew louder, more distinct, until Marcus could feel the vibrations through the soles of his boots. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves facing another door, this one bearing the kind of warning signs that made Marcus's blood run cold. Radiation symbols, biohazard markers, and text in multiple languages that essentially boiled down to the same message: authorized personnel only, extreme danger. Trespassers will be prosecuted under federal law. But the most unsettling detail was the keypad beside the door. its LED display glowing green with the words "System Active" scrolling across the screen. Whatever lay beyond that door had been running, unmaintained and unmonitored for decades. Marcus's finger hovered over the keypad, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was a broke veteran who'd bought a worthless bunker with his last $12,000, seeking nothing more than shelter and solitude. But standing in that underground corridor, with Duke's warm presence beside him, and the mechanical heartbeat of something vast and hidden echoing through the stone, he realized that he was about to cross a line between his old life and something entirely unknown. The code, when it came to him, felt less like memory than instinct. His fingers moved across the keypad, his military service number, the same digits he'd typed thousands of times over 15 years of service. The lock disengaged with a solid click that seemed to echo through eternity. As the massive door swung open, revealing a sight that would haunt and define the rest of his life, Marcus Chen understood that his $12,000 hadn't bought him a worthless
"Easy, boy," Marcus whispered, but his voice cracked with the weight of memories that had been clawing at him for 2 years. His therapist, Dr. Sarah Martinez, had warned him about triggers, unexpected sounds, confined spaces, the smell of machinery. She'd told him to practice his breathing techniques, to ground himself in the present moment. But standing in this underground chamber that shouldn't exist, Marcus felt the familiar spiral beginning, the way reality started to bend and blur around the edges. The attack had happened on a Tuesday. Marcus remembered that detail with crystalline clarity, even as other memories from that day fragmented like shattered glass. He'd been leading a routine patrol through a neighborhood in Kandahar that intelligence had cleared as safe. Duke had been working point, his nose detecting traces of explosives that human technology couldn't identify. They'd been a team for 8 years by then, longer than Marcus had been married to anyone, longer than he'd lived in any single place since childhood. Duke had alerted first, that sudden, rigid posture that every Hambler learned to read like gospel. The dog's body language had screamed danger, but the convoy was already committed to the route, and Marcus had hesitated for just a split second, doubting his partner's assessment against the reassurance of official intelligence reports. That hesitation, that single moment of human uncertainty, had cost them everything. Now, standing in the hidden facility, Marcus could feel his heart rate spiking the way it had in those seconds before the IED detonated. The computer screen seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the emergency lights that had flickered in the aftermath of the explosion, when he'd been lying in the dirt with Duke's blood soaking into his uniform, both of them broken in ways that would never fully heal. "Focus," he said aloud, using the grounding technique Dr. Martinez had taught him. 5 things you can see. The computer screens, the concrete walls, Duke's concerned amber eyes, a series of maps displayed on one monitor, his own reflection in a darkened screen, looking older than his 34 years, wearing the hollow expression that had become his default since coming home. But the facility demanded his attention in ways that his coping strategies couldn't manage. This wasn't just some abandoned Cold War bunker. It was an active installation, running operations that appeared to have continued without interruption for decades. The implications made his head spin with possibilities that ranged from fascinating to terrifying. The facility felt governmental, but not officially governmental. Everything was too clean, too advanced, too carefully hidden. This was the kind of operation that existed in the spaces between what the public knew and what actually happened, the shadow world that career military personnel learned not to discuss in polite company. He moved deeper into the facility, Duke padding silently beside him. The main chamber was larger than it had appeared from the doorway, extending back into alcoves and side rooms that suggested a complex far more extensive than his modest bunker purchase had implied. Workstations set empty but ready, as if their operators had simply stepped out for lunch and might return at any moment.
The first documents Marcus found were stored in a filing cabinet that should have been locked, but wasn't. The papers inside made his hands shake as he read them. Requisition orders, personnel files, and operational reports that bore the letterhead of organizations he'd never heard of, but which had the bureaucratic density of serious government work. Most of the documents were heavily redacted, but enough information remained to paint a picture of something called Project Deep Root, a research initiative that had apparently been running since the 1960s. Jesus Christ, Duke, Marcus breathed, sinking into a desk chair that squeaked with the protest of decades-old springs. What did we stumble into? The personnel files were the most disturbing discovery. Dozens of scientists, engineers, and military personnel had been assigned to the facility over the years, but according to the records, none of them had ever left. Their files simply stopped, with no transfer orders, no retirement paperwork, no indication of what happened to people who had dedicated their careers to whatever was happening in these underground chambers. Marcus thought about the real estate agent who had sold him the bunker, a nervous man named Peterson, who had seemed desperate to close the deal. Peterson had mentioned that the property had been in government hands for decades before being quietly transferred to private ownership to a series of shell companies. The seller had been eager to accept Marcus's low offer, almost suspiciously eager, as if getting rid of the property was more important than making money on the transaction.
The weight of realization settled on Marcus's shoulders like lead. He hadn't bought a worthless bunker. He'd been selected. Chosen as the kind of buyer who wouldn't ask inconvenient questions or attract unwanted attention. A broke veteran with a history of mental health issues would make the perfect owner for a property that needed to remain invisible. If something happened to him, if he disappeared like the scientists and engineers whose files he'd been reading, who would look for him? Who would even care? Duke's presence beside him was the only thing keeping Marcus anchored to sanity. The dog had been his lifeline through the darkest periods of his recovery, the living reminder that he still had something worth protecting. In the military, they'd called working dogs force multipliers, but Duke had been more than that. He'd been Marcus's translator between the world of violence and the world of peace, the bridge between who Marcus had been as a soldier and who he was trying to become as a civilian. Marcus had watched his partner retreat into himself, the confident, eager-to-work dog replaced by an animal who startled at loud noises and sometimes seemed to forget that they were no longer in Afghanistan. "We're both pretty messed up, aren't we?" Marcus said, reaching down to scratch behind Duke's ears. The dog leaned into the contact, seeking the same comfort that Marcus needed. They understood each other's damage in ways that no human relationship had ever achieved. Dr. Martinez called it shared trauma, but Marcus thought of it as love. The kind of love that emerged from surviving hell together and choosing to keep living despite the scars. The computer terminals were password protected, but Marcus's engineering background gave him enough technical knowledge to navigate the system's edges. He couldn't access the core files, but he could see enough to understand that Project Deep Root was still active. Data was being collected, processed, and transmitted to locations that the system identified only by alphanumeric codes. Whatever was happening in the facility was part of a larger network, a web of hidden installations that spanned the country. As the hours passed, Marcus began to understand the scope of what he'd discovered. The facility wasn't just a research station. It was a monitoring post, designed to track and analyze something that the government considered important enough to maintain for decades in absolute secrecy. The equipment was sophisticated enough to detect seismic activity, electromagnetic fluctuations, and atmospheric changes with precision that suggested they were looking for something specific. The most disturbing discovery came when Marcus found a maintenance log that had been updated just 3 days before his arrival. Someone had been in the facility recently, checking systems and ensuring that operations continued smoothly. The log was signed with initials that meant nothing to him, but the timing couldn't be coincidental. Someone knew he was coming. Duke began to pace as evening approached, his anxiety feeding Marcus's own growing paranoia. The facility felt like a trap, an elaborate snare designed to capture someone exactly like him, Someone desperate enough to buy property without asking too many questions, isolated enough that his disappearance wouldn't be immediately noticed, and damaged enough that his claims about hidden government facilities would be dismissed as PTSD-induced delusions. But Marcus had survived 3 combat deployments and 2 years of psychological rehabilitation by learning to distinguish between real threats and trauma-induced paranoia. This facility was real. The equipment was real. The implications were real. Whatever Project Deep Root was monitoring, it was important enough to justify decades of secrecy and the kind of budget that could maintain sophisticated equipment without official oversight. The weight of the discovery pressed down on him like the desert heat above ground. Instead, he'd found himself at the center of a mystery that could either provide the purpose his life had been lacking or destroy what remained of his sanity. As darkness fell above ground, Marcus made his first real decision since leaving the military. He would stay. He would learn what Project Deep Root was monitoring, and he would decide whether the people running this operation were protecting something important or hiding something dangerous. Duke would help him, the way they'd always helped each other, and together they would navigate whatever came next. The facility hummed around them with the sound of secrets keeping themselves, and Marcus Chen began to understand that his $12,000 had bought him much more than shelter. It had bought him a second chance at being someone who mattered. This transformation is just the beginning. If you're invested in Marcus and Duke's incredible discovery, hit subscribe and share this with someone who loves mysterious stories. The time I put into these tales is worth it when I see your engagement.
The breakthrough came at 3:17 a.m. on Marcus's 6th day in the facility, when Duke's restless pacing finally led them to a section of the complex they hadn't fully explored. The German Shepherd had been acting increasingly agitated, his military training manifesting in behaviors that Marcus recognized from their combat days. The way Duke would systematically search an area when he sensed something important but couldn't quite locate it. "What is it, boy?" Marcus whispered, following Duke through a narrow corridor that branched off from the main operations center. The dog's nose worked the air with the intensity Marcus remembered from IED detection sweeps, that focused concentration that had saved countless lives in Afghanistan. The corridor led to what appeared to be an observation deck, its thick glass windows looking down into a chamber that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. Below them, in a space that must have extended at least 50 feet beneath the Nevada desert, sat something that defied every assumption he'd made about the facility's purpose. It was a craft. Not a vehicle in any conventional sense, but an object of flowing, organic curves that seemed to absorb the facility's emergency lighting rather than reflect it. The craft was perhaps 40 feet long, its surface appearing to shift and ripple like liquid mercury even though it remained perfectly still. Banks of monitoring equipment surrounded it, their displays showing energy readings that spiked and fluctuated in patterns that suggested the object was alive rather than constructed. "Jesus fucking Christ," Marcus breathed, his military composure finally cracking. Duke pressed against his leg, whining softly, and Marcus realized his hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the observation window's rail. The implications crashed over him in waves. Project Deep Root wasn't monitoring atmospheric disturbances or seismic activity. They were studying something that had never been built by human hands. The facility wasn't a government research station. It was a prison, designed to contain and analyze something that had fallen from the sky or emerged from the earth decades ago. Marcus's mind raced through the personnel files he'd discovered, the scientists and engineers whose records simply stopped without explanation. Had they been transferred to other facilities, or had they learned too much about what was being kept in the chamber below? The maintenance logs suddenly took on a sinister significance. Someone was still caring for this thing, ensuring that whatever systems kept it contained continued to function properly. The sound that had drawn him to the facility in the first place wasn't mechanical at all. It was biological. The rhythmic pulse of something vast and alien that had been beating beneath the Nevada desert for longer than Marcus had been alive. The realization made him dizzy with a mixture of terror and wonder that reminded him of the moment he'd first come under enemy fire. That crystalline clarity that came with understanding that the world was far more dangerous and mysterious than he'd ever imagined.
Duke's sudden bark shattered the silence, and Marcus spun around to find they were no longer alone. A woman stood in the corridor behind them, her appearance so unexpected that Marcus's hand instinctively went to his hip, reaching for a sidearm he no longer carried. "Please don't be alarmed, Mr. Chen," the woman said, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that Marcus associated with senior military officers. She was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun, and wearing clothing that managed to look both casual and official. "Waiting for me?" Marcus managed, his voice hoarse with shock. Who are you?" Dr. Vasquez stepped closer, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. "I'm currently the director of Project Deeproot, a position I've held for the past 8 years. I'm also the person who authorized your purchase of this property, Mr. Chen. We've been monitoring your progress since you arrived." The admission hit Marcus like a physical blow. "You've been watching me? For how long?" "Since you were discharged from the military," Dr. Vasquez replied, settling into a chair that Marcus hadn't noticed before. The casual nature of her response suggested she'd had this conversation many times. "Your psychological profile, your military experience with Duke, your need for isolation, you were exactly what we've been looking for." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that signaled the beginning of a panic attack. The breathing techniques Dr. Martinez had taught him seemed useless in the face of revelations that challenged everything he thought he understood about his own life. "What? Looking for what? What do you want from me?" Dr. Vasquez gestured towards the observation window and the craft below. "We need someone to communicate with it, Mr. Chen. Someone who understands trauma, who has experience with beings that don't process information the way humans do. Someone who has learned to trust nonverbal communication in life-or-death situations." The suggestion was so absurd that Marcus almost laughed. "You want me to talk to that thing? Are you completely insane?" "The entity in the containment chamber has been here since 1962. It arrived during the height of the Cold War when we were conducting atmospheric nuclear tests just 100 miles from this location. We don't know if it came here intentionally or if our testing damaged something that was already present in the area. What we do know is that it's been trying to communicate with us for over 60 years."
Marcus stared at the craft through the observation window, trying to process information that felt like it belonged in a science fiction movie rather than his actual life. "And you think I can somehow understand what it wants?" "Previous attempts at communication have failed because we approached the entity as scientists and military personnel," Dr. Vasquez explained. "We've tried mathematical sequences, linguistic patterns, technological interfaces, everything that human logic suggests might work for interspecies communication. But what if we've been approaching this backwards? What if the entity doesn't communicate through language or mathematics? What if it communicates through something more fundamental?" Duke had been listening to the conversation with the kind of focused attention he'd shown during mission briefings in Afghanistan. Now he moved to the observation window and placed his paws on the glass, staring down at the craft with an intensity that made Marcus's pulse quicken. "Emotional resonance," Marcus said suddenly, understanding flooding through him like cold water. "You think it communicates through feelings, trauma, shared experience." Dr. Vasquez nodded approvingly. "Every person who has spent extended time in the entity's presence has reported powerful emotional experiences. Some describe overwhelming sadness, others report feelings of profound isolation or loss. A few have mentioned sensations that remind them of their most traumatic memories." The explanation made horrifying sense. Marcus had been selected not for his technical skills or his educational background, but for his psychological damage, his PTSD, his survivor's guilt, his profound sense of disconnection from the civilian world. All of it made him uniquely qualified to communicate with something that might be experiencing its own form of cosmic trauma. "The previous directors of this project," Marcus said slowly, "the ones whose files just stop, what happened to them?" Dr. Vasquez's expression darkened. "Some were transferred to other facilities when they requested reassignment. Others suffered psychological breaks when extended exposure to the entity triggered their own unresolved trauma. A few..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. A few decided that they needed to be closer to the entity than our safety protocols allow. Marcus felt Duke press against his leg, the dog's warmth grounding him as the implications of Dr. Vasquez's words sank in. They went into the chamber. The entity doesn't appear to be malicious, but it is powerful in ways we don't fully understand. Direct contact seems to create a kind of psychological fusion, a joining of consciousness that human minds aren't equipped to handle. The few people who have attempted direct contact... Dr. Vasquez trailed off, but her expression completed the thought. Marcus moved back to the observation window, studying the craft with new understanding. The organic curves weren't just alien architecture. They suggested something alive, something that might be as lonely and damaged as he was. The rhythmic pulsing that had drawn him to the facility took on new meaning when he considered it might be the heartbeat of a creature that had been imprisoned for over half a century. "What makes you think I won't end up like the others?" "Your partnership with Duke," Dr. Vasquez replied immediately. "Every previous attempt at communication has involved humans working alone, but you and Duke have already learned to communicate across species barriers. You've developed trust and understanding without sharing a common language. Most importantly, you've both survived profound trauma without losing your essential humanity." Duke's sudden whine drew Marcus's attention back to the observation window. The craft below seemed to be responding to their presence, its surface patterns shifting in ways that created the optical illusion of movement, even though the object remained stationary. The monitoring equipment showed energy spikes that corresponded to Duke's vocalizations, as if the entity was trying to respond to the dog's communication attempts. "It's responding to him," Marcus whispered. "Animals have always been more sensitive to the entity's presence," Dr. Vasquez confirmed. "We've had several animals brought into the facility over the years, and all of them showed immediate awareness of the entity. Dogs in particular seem to understand something about its nature that humans miss." Marcus watched Duke's behavior, recognizing the same focused attention the dog had shown when working with traumatized soldiers during their military service. Now that same sensitivity seemed to be engaging with something far more alien, but equally damaged.
The next few hours passed in a blur of briefings, technical demonstrations, and psychological evaluations that made Marcus feel like he was being processed for a military operation that no one wanted to fully explain. Dr. Vasquez introduced him to the facility's small staff, 3 technicians who monitored the entity's vital signs, and 2 security personnel who seemed more concerned with keeping information from leaving the facility than with keeping intruders from entering. The technical specifications of the entity's containment were staggering. The chamber was lined with materials designed to absorb electromagnetic radiation, preventing the entity from communicating with potential allies or affecting electronic systems beyond the facility. Temperature and atmospheric controls maintained conditions that were theoretically optimal for a being that might have evolved in the cold vacuum of space or the crushing depths of an alien ocean. "We've learned that the entity responds to different stimuli in predictable ways," Dr. Vasquez explained, showing Marcus readouts from decades of observation. "Emotional trauma in nearby humans creates the strongest reactions. Times of high stress or psychological crisis seem to activate dormant systems in the craft. We believe it's trying to help, to provide some form of comfort or healing, but human psychology isn't equipped to process whatever it's offering." Marcus studied the data with the analytical mind that had made him an effective combat engineer. The patterns were clear once he understood what he was looking for. The entity's activity spiked whenever humans in its proximity were experiencing emotional distress. It wasn't malicious or predatory, it was trying to heal trauma it could sense but didn't understand. "It's empathic," Marcus realized. "It feels our pain and tries to fix it, but it doesn't understand human psychology well enough to help safely." "That's our working theory," Dr. Vasquez agreed, "which is why we need someone who understands both trauma and recovery, someone who can guide the entity toward forms of healing that won't destroy human consciousness in the process." The weight of responsibility was crushing.
Marcus had come to Nevada seeking nothing more than isolation and peace, but now he was being asked to become humanity's ambassador to something that might hold the key to healing psychological wounds that conventional medicine couldn't touch. The irony wasn't lost on him. The broken veteran and his damaged dog were being asked to fix something that had been trying to fix itself for longer than either of them had been alive. Duke's behavior over the following days confirmed Marcus's growing understanding of the situation. The dog spent hours at the observation window, sometimes whining softly as if trying to communicate comfort to the entity below. His military alertness had returned, but it was focused entirely on the alien presence rather than potential human threats. Duke seemed to understand, in ways that Marcus was still struggling to accept, that they had found their new mission. The first direct communication attempt was scheduled for the following Monday, giving Marcus a weekend to prepare himself mentally for an experience that no amount of military training could have anticipated. Dr. Vasquez provided him with research files, psychological preparation protocols, and emergency procedures that were simultaneously reassuring and terrifying in their thoroughness. But it was during Saturday night, as Marcus lay on his cot listening to the desert wind above ground, that he began to understand the true scope of what he'd stumbled into. The entity wasn't just an alien presence. It was a refugee, possibly the last survivor of a species that had been destroyed by the same kind of nuclear testing that had dominated Earth's military strategy during the Cold War. Project Deeproot wasn't just monitoring an alien craft. They were providing palliative care for a dying god, something so far beyond human understanding that its pain had been echoing through the Nevada desert for over half a century, waiting for someone damaged enough to recognize the sound of cosmic trauma. As Duke pressed against his side in the familiar comfort ritual that had sustained them both through their darkest nights, Marcus Chen began to understand that his $12,000 hadn't just bought him a worthless bunker, or even a government secret. It had bought him the chance to heal something that had been trying to heal the entire world, one broken mind at a time, without understanding why humans kept destroying themselves rather than accepting the gift it was trying to offer. Monday morning was coming, and with it, the moment when a broke veteran and his traumatized dog would attempt to bridge a gap between species that had been 60 years in the making. The weight of that responsibility should have been crushing, but for the first time since leaving the military, Marcus Chen felt like he had found a mission that mattered. Monday arrived with the kind of crystalline desert clarity that Marcus had learned to associate with moments that would change everything. He stood before the sealed entrance to the containment chamber, wearing a biomonitoring suit that felt uncomfortably similar to the tactical gear he'd worn in Afghanistan, complete with sensors that would track his vital signs and neural activity during what Dr. Vasquez called the most significant interspecies contact attempt in human history.
Duke stood beside him, wearing a modified service harness equipped with similar monitoring equipment. The German Shepherd's calm confidence was the only thing keeping Marcus's anxiety from spiraling into full panic. They had prepared for this moment with the same methodical attention to detail that had defined their military operations, but no amount of preparation could prepare someone for stepping into a room with something that had traveled between stars. "Remember, Marcus," Dr. Vasquez's voice crackled through the earpiece. "The entity has been trying to communicate with us for 60 years. It's not hostile, it's desperate. Let that desperation recognize the desperation you've carried since Afghanistan. Let your trauma speak to its trauma." The chamber door opened with a pneumatic hiss that reminded Marcus of the doors on armored vehicles, that moment of transition between safety and the unknown. The space beyond was larger than it had appeared from the observation deck, its walls curving upward into shadows that the facility's lighting couldn't quite penetrate. The alien craft dominated the center of the chamber, its organic curves more pronounced at this proximity, as if proximity to human consciousness caused it to become more alive. Marcus's first step into the chamber sent waves of sensation through his nervous system that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition.
The entity's presence wasn't just alien, it was familiar in the way that profound pain was familiar. The kind of soul-deep ache that every combat veteran carried, like shrapnel that could never be fully removed. Duke's reaction was immediate and startling. The dog's military alertness dissolved into something Marcus had never seen before, a kind of spiritual surrender that reminded him of the way Duke would sometimes lie in sunbeams, completely at peace with the world. The German Shepherd walked directly to the craft and placed his paw against its surface, and the result was instantaneous. The chamber filled with light that wasn't quite light, a luminescence that seemed to originate from within Marcus's own consciousness rather than from any external source. Images flooded his mind, not visual memories, but emotional impressions that carried information in ways that bypassed language entirely. He saw a world that had never known violence, where beings of incredible intelligence and empathy had developed across millions of years without ever learning to harm one another. He felt the confusion and terror that had gripped that civilization when their solar system began to die, not from natural causes, but from the expansion of something darker, a plague of consciousness that consumed empathy and replaced it with the kind of aggressive competition that drove species to destroy themselves and everything around them. The entity had been one of the few survivors, fleeing across impossible distances in a craft that was as much a part of its body as its heart or brain. It had arrived in Earth's solar system during the 1960s, drawn by signals that suggested a young civilization was developing the same plague of consciousness that had destroyed its own world: nuclear weapons, environmental destruction, the systematic brutalization of its own species. But instead of finding a world to conquer or avoid, the entity had encountered something unexpected. Humans who carried wounds identical to its own. Soldiers returning from wars they didn't understand. Civilians traumatized by violence that served no purpose. Entire populations struggling with psychological damage that their primitive understanding of consciousness couldn't heal. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face as the entity's purpose became clear. It hadn't come to Earth as an invader or even as a refugee. It had come as a healer, drawn by the psychic screaming of a species that was traumatizing itself to death. For 60 years, it had been trying to offer the same healing that had sustained its own civilization through millions of years of peaceful development. The problem was translation. Human consciousness processed trauma in ways that were fundamentally different from the entity's species. What would heal a being of pure empathy and cosmic perspective could shatter a human mind that had evolved to survive through aggression and competition. Every attempt at direct healing had either failed completely or succeeded so thoroughly that the human consciousness was fundamentally altered, losing the essential qualities that made it human in the first place. "Duke," Marcus whispered, understanding flooding through him as he watched his partner maintain contact with the craft. "Duke, you're translating." The dog's presence was serving as a buffer, a bridge between human and alien consciousness that allowed for communication without the psychological fusion that had destroyed previous contact attempts. Duke's military training, his experience with human trauma, and his natural empathy were creating a three-way conversation where each species could maintain its essential nature while still sharing information. Through Duke's mediation, Marcus began to understand the true scope of what they were dealing with. The entity wasn't just a refugee, it was a living library of healing techniques that could revolutionize human understanding of psychological trauma. It carried within its consciousness the accumulated wisdom of a species that had eliminated not just war and violence, but the psychological conditions that led to those destructive behaviors. But accessing that knowledge safely required a translator who could understand both human trauma and the entity's method of healing, someone who had experienced the worst that human consciousness could endure while maintaining enough emotional stability to serve as a bridge between species.
"The others," Marcus said aloud, his voice echoing strangely in the chamber. "The people who disappeared, they tried to accept the healing directly." Images flowed through his consciousness in response to his words, showing him the fate of scientists and military personnel who had attempted direct contact over the decades. The entity had tried to heal their trauma the same way it would heal one of its own species,
by dissolving the boundaries between individual consciousness and cosmic awareness. For humans, this was indistinguishable from death, even though the consciousness persisted in a form that the entity considered healthy and whole. Dr. Vasquez's voice in his earpiece had taken on an urgency that cut through the flow of alien communication. "Marcus, your neural activity is approaching dangerous levels. We need you to step back from direct contact." But Marcus could feel that they were on the verge of a breakthrough that could change everything. The entity was offering to share not just its healing techniques, but its understanding of consciousness itself, knowledge that could help humanity evolve beyond the aggressive instinct that had brought it to the brink of self-destruction. "Duke," Marcus said, placing his hand on his partner's back while the dog maintained contact with the craft. "Can you help me stay human while I learn what it's trying to teach?" The German shepherd's response was a low whine that somehow conveyed complete understanding and absolute commitment. Duke had spent years learning to translate human emotional states for other humans, helping traumatized soldiers communicate their needs to medical personnel who didn't understand the language of combat stress. Now he was applying those same skills to a problem of cosmic significance. The knowledge transfer began slowly, mediated by Duke's presence, and filtered through Marcus's hard-won understanding of psychological recovery. Instead of overwhelming him with cosmic perspective, the entity began sharing specific healing techniques that had been adapted for human consciousness, ways of processing trauma that acknowledged human psychology while offering genuine relief from the kind of suffering that conventional medicine couldn't touch. Marcus saw how to guide human consciousness through trauma recovery by embracing pain rather than suppressing it, by treating psychological wounds as information rather than damage. He understood how to help people integrate traumatic experiences into their sense of identity without being consumed by those experiences. Most importantly, he learned how to teach these techniques to others without losing the essential human qualities that made the healing meaningful. The process felt like learning to speak a new language, but instead of words and grammar, he was absorbing ways of thinking about consciousness itself. The entity species had discovered that trauma could be transformed into wisdom through specific mental processes that humans instinctively avoided because they seemed to lead toward more pain rather than less. "It's counterintuitive," Marcus breathed, understanding flooding through him. "Human instinct is to avoid the pain, but that just keeps the trauma locked in place. The healing comes from moving toward the pain, but in a way that integrates it instead of being overwhelmed by it." Through Duke's translation, he began to understand why the entity had been drawn to Earth specifically. Human consciousness had evolved a unique relationship with trauma that made it both more vulnerable and more capable of growth than most species. The same psychological flexibility that allowed humans to survive in hostile environments also gave them the potential to transform suffering into wisdom in ways that the entity's own species had never achieved. But that transformation required guidance, the kind of careful support that could help human consciousness navigate the process without losing its essential humanity. The revelation that followed was the most profound of all. The entity wasn't alone. It was part of a network of survivors from its civilization, scattered across the galaxy and drawn to worlds where young species were struggling with the same psychological plagues that had nearly destroyed their own development. Earth was one of hundreds of worlds receiving this kind of intervention, each one adapted to the specific consciousness patterns of its indigenous species. "We're not alone," Marcus whispered, the implications staggering him. "And we're not the first species to face this kind of crisis." The entity showed him glimpses of other worlds, other species that had successfully integrated the healing knowledge and evolved beyond their self-destructive patterns. Some had become spacefaring civilizations dedicated to helping other species through similar transitions. Others had chosen to focus on perfecting their own consciousness, becoming living examples of what psychological evolution could achieve.
But some species had rejected the healing, choosing to cling to their aggressive patterns until they destroyed themselves completely. The entity carried the memory of dozens of worlds that had chosen extinction over transformation, their final communications filled with the same kind of desperate violence that characterized humanity's current trajectory. "That's why you're still here," Marcus realized. After 60 years, you're still trying because you believe we can make a different choice. The affirmation that flooded through him was so powerful that it brought him to his knees. The entity's faith in humanity's potential was absolute, based on its observation of individuals like Marcus and Duke who had managed to transform their own trauma into wisdom and compassion. Every human who recovered from psychological wounds without losing their capacity for empathy was proof that the species as a whole could evolve beyond its current limitations. Dr. Vasquez's voice cut through the revelation with sharp urgency. "Marcus, you need to end the session now. Your neural patterns are showing signs of permanent alteration." But Marcus could feel that there was one more piece of information the entity needed to share, something crucial that would determine whether the knowledge he'd gained could be successfully transmitted to other humans. Through Duke's steadying presence, he opened himself to one final exchange. What he received was a gift beyond anything he could have imagined, the complete healing template that the entity species had developed over millions of years of psychological evolution. Not just techniques for treating individual trauma, but a comprehensive understanding of how consciousness could be restructured to eliminate the root causes of human violence and self-destruction. The knowledge was vast and complex, but it was also practical, a step-by-step process that could be taught to human therapists, social workers, and medical professionals. It wouldn't require advanced technology or alien intervention. It would only require humans who were willing to approach psychological healing with the same dedication and precision that they brought to physical medicine. As Marcus slowly withdrew from direct contact with the entity, Duke maintaining the connection until the last possible moment, he understood that his life had just been redefined in ways that would take years to fully comprehend. He wasn't just a broken veteran anymore. He was humanity's first student in a curriculum that could save the species from destroying itself. The chamber lights seemed harsh and artificial after the luminous communication with the entity, but Marcus felt more grounded and present than he had since before the explosion in Afghanistan. The knowledge he'd gained wasn't just theoretical. It had already begun healing wounds in his own consciousness that he'd thought were permanent. Dr. Vasquez was waiting for him as he emerged from the chamber, her expression a mixture of scientific excitement and deep concern. "How do you feel? Are you still you?" Marcus looked down at Duke, who was wagging his tail with the satisfied expression of a job well done. "I'm more me than I've been in years," he said, and realized it was completely true. "And I know what we have to do next." The entity's gift came with a responsibility that would define the rest of his life, to become the bridge between human and alien consciousness that could help his species evolve beyond its current trajectory of self-destruction. He had the knowledge, he had the partner who could help him maintain his humanity during the process, and most importantly, he had the understanding that this was why he'd survived Afghanistan. Not to return to a normal civilian life that had never fit him anyway, but to become part of the most important mission in human history, the transformation of consciousness that would determine whether humanity joined the galactic community of evolved species or followed the path of those worlds that had chosen extinction over growth. As he looked back at the chamber where an alien entity had been waiting 60 years for someone like him to arrive, Marcus Chen began to understand that his $12,000 had bought him far more than shelter or purpose. It had bought him the chance to help save the world. 3 months after first contact, Marcus Chen stood in what had once been the main living area of his worthless bunker, now transformed into something that defied easy categorization. Part therapy center, part research facility, part training ground for what he'd begun calling consciousness integration work. The space hummed with the quiet energy of profound change taking root. The first person he'd called wasn't Dr. Vasquez or any government official. It had been Dr. Sarah Martinez when Marcus explained that he needed her help with a breakthrough in trauma treatment that's going to sound completely insane. Dr. Martinez sat across from him now, her notebook filled with observations that would either revolutionize her field or convince her that her former patient had suffered a complete psychological break. Duke lay between them, serving as the living bridge that made their conversation possible, not just between Marcus and Dr. Martinez, but between human consciousness and the alien knowledge that had been carefully integrated into Marcus's understanding over weeks of gradual exposure. "Show me again," Dr. Martinez said, her clinical training warring with the evidence of her own eyes. But slowly this time. Marcus placed his hand on Duke's back, feeling the familiar warmth that had become the anchor point for everything that followed. The healing techniques weren't magic, they were psychology, but psychology that approached consciousness from directions that human science had never considered. Instead of treating trauma as damage to be repaired, the alien methodology treated it as information to be integrated, energy that could be transformed rather than suppressed. The key is recognizing that trauma creates what the entity calls consciousness fragments, Marcus explained, his voice taking on the careful precision he'd learned from months of translating alien concepts into human language. Instead of trying to forget or overcome traumatic experiences, we guide the patient through a process of conscious integration where the trauma becomes part of their wisdom rather than their wound. Dr. Martinez watched as Marcus demonstrated the technique on himself, using his memories of the IED explosion in Afghanistan as the raw material. Instead of the familiar spiral of anxiety and flashbacks that those memories usually triggered, Marcus guided his consciousness through a process that felt like emotional alchemy, transforming the pain and terror into something that strengthened rather than weakened his sense of self. The change in his physiological markers was measurable. His heart rate remained steady, his breathing stayed controlled, and the muscle tension that had been his constant companion since returning from combat visibly relaxed. But more than that, his relationship to the memory itself had shifted. The explosion was still traumatic, still a moment of profound loss and pain, but it was no longer a wound that controlled his life. "It's not suppression," Dr. Martinez observed, making notes with the focus intensity that Marcus remembered from their therapy sessions. "You're not pushing the trauma away or trying to minimize its impact. You're actually engaging with it more directly than conventional therapy would recommend." The alien species discovered that consciousness naturally wants to integrate traumatic experiences, but human psychology has evolved defense mechanisms that interrupt that integration process. We avoid the pain, which keeps the trauma locked in a state where it can't be processed. The alien techniques teach us how to move through the defensive reactions and complete the integration that our consciousness was trying to achieve all along. Duke's presence was essential to the process. The German Shepherd's empathetic abilities, enhanced by his exposure to the entity, allowed him to serve as a kind of emotional translator during the integration work. When patients became overwhelmed by the intensity of directly engaging with their trauma, Duke could sense the exact moment when they need support and provide a stabilizing presence that kept them grounded in safety while they processed dangerous memories. The first veteran Marcus worked with was a Marine named Jennifer Reyes, whose PTSD had been resistant to every form of conventional treatment. She'd heard about Marcus through the underground network that connected combat veterans across the country, and she'd driven to Nevada with the desperate hope of someone who had exhausted all other options. "I don't care if this is experimental or unproven or completely crazy," she'd told Marcus during their initial consultation. "I've been living in hell for 5 years, and if there's a chance this could help, I'll try anything." The session with Jennifer lasted 6 hours and left Marcus emotionally drained but profoundly hopeful. Using Duke as a bridge and the alien techniques as a framework, they'd guided Jennifer through an integration process that addressed not just her combat trauma, but the childhood abuse that had made her vulnerable to PTSD in the first place. By the end of the session, she was crying with relief rather than pain, her consciousness having finally been able to complete the processing that it had been trying to achieve for decades. "It feels like I've been carrying around broken glass inside my chest," Jennifer said as the session concluded, "and now the glass is still there, but it's been turned into something beautiful instead of something that cuts me."
Word spread through channels that Marcus hadn't anticipated. Veterans organizations, trauma treatment centers, and medical professionals who specialized in PTSD began reaching out with requests for training, consultation, and treatment. Within 2 months, Marcus was receiving calls from around the world. Researchers who had heard rumors about revolutionary trauma treatment techniques being developed in a Nevada bunker. Patients who had been failed by conventional therapy, and medical professionals who were desperate for new approaches to problems that had seemed intractable. Dr. Vasquez had initially been concerned about the exposure, worried that revealing the alien source of the healing techniques would compromise Project Deep Root's security. But as she watched the results accumulating, veterans who had been suicidal becoming stable and productive, trauma survivors finding peace for the first time in years, therapists reporting breakthrough results with patients who had been considered untreatable, she began to understand that the entity's mission was larger than any government classification. "The knowledge wants to spread," Marcus explained during one of their regular briefings. "That's how the entity species survived their own psychological evolution. The healing techniques are designed to be taught, shared, and adapted. Keeping them secret defeats their entire purpose." The compromise they reached transformed Project Deep Root from a containment operation into something unprecedented in government history, a classified program dedicated to the controlled release of beneficial alien technology. Marcus became the primary trainer for a carefully selected group of medical professionals, teaching them the consciousness integration techniques, while Duke served as the bridge that made the learning possible. The training program was intensive and transformative. Medical professionals who entered the program as conventional therapists emerged as practitioners of something that felt more like consciousness engineering than traditional psychology. They learned to guide patients through integration processes that addressed not just individual trauma, but the systemic patterns of consciousness that led to trauma in the first place. Dr. Martinez became the program's first official graduate, her own transformation from conventional therapist to integration specialist serving as proof of concept for the entire enterprise. She returned to her practice in Sacramento with skills that seemed almost supernatural to her colleagues, able to help patients achieve in single sessions what had previously taken months or years of conventional therapy. The most remarkable thing, she reported during one of their regular check-ins, is how natural it feels once you understand the process. It's like we've been trying to heal broken bones by ignoring them instead of setting them properly. Once you know how consciousness actually wants to process trauma, the healing becomes inevitable rather than hopeful. But the real breakthrough came when Marcus realized that the techniques didn't just work for combat veterans and trauma survivors. They were effective for anyone's consciousness had been fragmented by experiences that exceeded their ability to process, which, according to the entity's understanding, included virtually every human being on the planet. Modern civilization itself was traumatic in ways that humans had learned to accept as normal. The disconnection from nature, the competitive pressure of economic systems, the constant exposure to violence and suffering through media, all of it created what the entity recognized as systematic consciousness fragmentation that kept humans locked in cycles of anxiety, depression, and aggressive behavior.
The healing techniques that worked for PTSD also worked for anxiety disorders, depression, addiction, and even personality disorders that had previously been considered largely untreatable. By teaching people how to integrate their consciousness fragments rather than suppressing them, the techniques address the root causes of psychological dysfunction rather than just managing symptoms.
Marcus began working with Dr. Martinez to develop a training curriculum that could be taught in medical schools, psychology programs, and social work education. The goal wasn't just to treat individual trauma, but to transform humanity's entire approach to consciousness and mental health. The entity, during their regular communication sessions, expressed something that Marcus could only interpret as satisfaction. Through Duke's translation, it shared images of other worlds where similar integration had taken place. Species that had successfully evolved beyond their self-destructive patterns and joined the galactic community of conscious civilizations. But it also shared warnings about the resistance that would inevitably emerge. Species that were in the process of psychological evolution always produced individuals who were invested in maintaining the old patterns of consciousness. On some worlds, this resistance had been mild and easily overcome. On others, it had led to violence and temporary setbacks that delayed the evolutionary process for generations. The key, Marcus told the growing network of integration practitioners, is to demonstrate the effectiveness of the techniques rather than trying to convince people intellectually. When someone experiences consciousness integration for themselves, the benefits become undeniable. But we have to be patient and strategic about how we introduce these concepts to a world that's built around fragmented consciousness. The Nevada facility became a pilgrimage site for medical professionals from around the world. Marcus and Duke worked tirelessly, training new practitioners while continuing to develop and refine the techniques based on their growing understanding of how alien consciousness integration could be adapted for human psychology. 6 months after first contact, Marcus received a call that would define the next phase of his mission. The caller identified herself as Dr. Elena Rodriguez, director of the World Health Organization's Mental Health Division, and she was calling to invite Marcus to present his techniques to an international conference of trauma specialists. We're seeing reports of unprecedented success rates from practitioners who have trained with you. Success rates that are so far beyond conventional therapy that they're causing us to question everything we thought we knew about treating psychological trauma. The invitation represented both opportunity and danger. Presenting the techniques to the international medical community would accelerate their adoption and help millions of trauma survivors around the world. But it would also expose the work to scrutiny and potential suppression by organizations that had invested careers and fortunes in conventional approaches to mental health. Marcus looked at Duke, who had been listening to the conversation, with the focused attention that meant he was processing complex information. The dog's tail wagged once, the signal they'd developed to indicate that he sensed an opportunity rather than a threat. "We'll be there," Marcus told Dr. Rodriguez, "but I'll be bringing my partner with me. The techniques don't work without him." As he hung up the phone, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him from a broken veteran seeking isolation to humanity's first ambassador to alien consciousness. The worthless bunker he'd bought with his last $12,000 had become the epicenter of a transformation that could save the human species from destroying itself. The entity, during their regular communication sessions, had been waiting 60 years for someone like him to arrive. Someone damaged enough to understand trauma from the inside, but stable enough to serve as a bridge between human and alien consciousness. Duke had been the key that made that bridge possible, his empathetic abilities allowing for communication that preserved human nature while accessing alien wisdom. Together, they had created something unprecedented, a healing methodology that could address the root causes of human psychological dysfunction while maintaining the essential qualities that made humanity unique. The techniques weren't just treating individual trauma, they were laying the groundwork for a species-wide evolution of consciousness that could eliminate the psychological patterns that led to war, environmental destruction, and systematic oppression.
Standing in his transformed bunker, surrounded by the evidence of lives that had been fundamentally changed by alien knowledge, Marcus Chen understood that his mission was just beginning. The techniques had been proven, the training network was established, and the medical community was beginning to pay attention. Now came the real challenge. introducing revolutionary healing concepts to a world that had built its entire civilization around the assumption that psychological suffering was inevitable, and that the best humans could hope for was to manage their pain rather than transform it. The entity had shown him glimpses of what humanity could become, a species that had evolved beyond aggression and self-destruction, joining a galactic community dedicated to consciousness development and mutual support. But achieving that transformation would require patience, wisdom, and the kind of strategic thinking that Marcus was still learning to navigate. As the sun set over the Nevada desert, casting long shadows across the landscape where his journey had begun, Marcus placed his hand on Duke's head and felt the familiar warmth that connected them to something larger than themselves. They had become the bridge between worlds, and the real work was just beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Chen Institute for Consciousness Integration, its glass and steel architecture rising from the Nevada desert like a monument to humanity's capacity for transformation. Dr. Marcus Chen, now 59 with silver threading through his dark hair, stood at the window of his office watching the latest group of international students arrive for the Advanced Practitioner Program. 25 years after his first contact with the entity, the Institute had become the epicenter of a revolution in human consciousness that had quietly reshaped civilization. Duke was gone now, having passed peacefully in his sleep 7 years earlier at the remarkable age of 16. His legacy lived on in the dozens of specially trained therapy dogs that worked throughout the Institute, each one selected and educated using principles that Duke had helped establish. But more than that, Duke's essential contribution, the bridge between human and alien consciousness, had been internalized by thousands of practitioners who could now facilitate the integration process without needing a canine translator. The numbers told a story that would have seemed impossible in 2025. Global rates of PTSD, anxiety disorders, and depression had declined by over 60% in the past 2 decades. Suicide rates among veterans had dropped by 80%. Crime statistics showed corresponding decreases in violence, addiction, and the kinds of social dysfunction that had once seemed endemic to human civilization. But the most profound changes couldn't be captured in statistics. Humanity was becoming something different, not less human, but more fully human in ways that had been dormant for millennia. The consciousness integration techniques had revealed that what most people had accepted as normal human nature was actually a collection of trauma responses that could be healed once people learned how to process their experiences completely. Dr. Sarah Martinez, now the Institute's Director of Training and Marcus's closest collaborator, entered his office carrying the morning briefing that had become their daily ritual. At 72, she moved with the vitality of someone half her age, her consciousness integration work having reversed many of the physical effects of stress and trauma that had accumulated over her early career in conventional psychology. She settled into the chair across from Marcus's desk, and Marcus nodded as he reviewed the report with the satisfaction of work that had exceeded every expectation. The Chen Institute now had training centers on every continent, each one adapted to the specific consciousness patterns and cultural needs of its region. What had begun as a treatment for combat veterans had evolved into a comprehensive approach to healing the psychological wounds that every human society carried in different forms. Any word from the Geneva summit?
Dr. Martinez's expression brightened with excitement that made her look decades younger. The UN Security Council voted unanimously to adopt consciousness integration as the standard treatment for international conflict resolution. Every diplomatic corps will have trained practitioners within 2 years. The implications were staggering. Wars hadn't been eliminated. Human consciousness was still evolving, and some regions lagged behind others in adopting the new approaches to conflict. But armed conflicts had become increasingly rare as world leaders learned to process their own psychological fragmentations and recognize the trauma patterns that drove aggressive behavior. The entity, during Marcus's regular communication sessions, had expressed what could only be described as profound satisfaction with humanity's progress. Through the neural interface technology that had been developed to replace Duke's translation abilities, the alien consciousness shared updates from other worlds where similar transformations were taking place. Humanity was no longer alone in its evolutionary journey. It had become part of a galactic community of species that were actively supporting each other's consciousness development. "There's something else," Dr. Martinez said, her tone shifting to the careful neutrality that meant she was about to deliver news that would either be wonderful or terrible. "The screening committee has approved your application for the Deep Contact program." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. The Deep Contact program was the next phase of human-alien cooperation, involving direct consciousness merger with the entity for extended periods. Only a handful of humans had attempted it, and all of them had emerged fundamentally transformed, no longer entirely human, but not quite alien either. They served as permanent bridges between the species, living translations of consciousness patterns that were essential for humanity's continued evolution. The decision had been made in years. Marcus had accomplished everything he'd hoped to achieve with the Institute and the global consciousness integration movement. His techniques were being taught in medical schools around the world, practiced by millions of therapists, and integrated into educational systems that were raising the first generation of truly psychologically healthy humans in recorded history. But the entity, during Marcus's regular communication sessions, had expressed what could only be described as profound satisfaction with humanity's progress. Through the neural interface technology that had been developed to replace Duke's translation abilities, the alien consciousness shared updates from other worlds where similar transformations were taking place. Humanity was no longer alone in its evolutionary journey. It had become part of a galactic community of species that were actively supporting each other's consciousness development. "There's something else," Dr. Martinez said, her tone shifting to the careful neutrality that meant she was about to deliver news that would either be wonderful or terrible. "The screening committee has approved your application for the Deep Contact program." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. The Deep Contact program was the next phase of human-alien cooperation, involving direct consciousness merger with the entity for extended periods. Only a handful of humans had attempted it, and all of them had emerged fundamentally transformed, no longer entirely human, but not quite alien either. They served as permanent bridges between the species, living translations of consciousness patterns that were essential for humanity's continued evolution. The decision had been made in years. Marcus had accomplished everything he'd hoped to achieve with the Institute and the global consciousness integration movement. His techniques were being taught in medical schools around the world, practiced by millions of therapists, and integrated into educational systems that were raising the first generation of truly psychologically healthy humans in recorded history. But the entity, during Marcus's regular communication sessions, had expressed what could only be described as profound satisfaction with humanity's progress. Through the neural interface technology that had been developed to replace Duke's translation abilities, the alien consciousness shared updates from other worlds where similar transformations were taking place. Humanity was no longer alone in its evolutionary journey. It had become part of a galactic community of species that were actively supporting each other's consciousness development. "There's something else," Dr. Martinez said, consulting her notes. "The screening committee has approved your application for the Deep Contact program." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. The Deep Contact program was the next phase of human-alien cooperation, involving direct consciousness merger with the entity for extended periods. Only a handful of humans had attempted it, and all of them had emerged fundamentally transformed, no longer entirely human, but not quite alien either. They served as permanent bridges between the species,
living translations of consciousness patterns that were essential for humanity's continued evolution. "How long do I have to decide?" Marcus asked. The entity says there's no timeline pressure, but it also indicated that the optimal window for your individual transformation is probably the next few years. After that, human consciousness patterns become too fixed for the kind of merger that deep contact requires. Marcus looked out the window at the students gathering for their morning sessions. Many of them were young people who had grown up with consciousness integration as a normal part of their education, their mental development unencumbered by the trauma patterns that had defined previous generations. They represented humanity's future, a species that was learning to process experience completely, avoiding the psychological fragmentations that had driven millennia of conflict and suffering. The choice before him was profound. He could continue his work as a human, guiding humanity's evolution from within the species, or he could undergo the transformation that would make him something new, a permanent bridge between human and alien consciousness that could facilitate even more advanced forms of development. How much time do I have to decide?
The afternoon found Marcus in the underground chamber where his journey had begun, standing before the entity that had been waiting in the Nevada desert for over 60 years. The alien craft had changed over the decades of regular communication. Its organic curves had become more pronounced, its surface patterns more complex, as if proximity to human consciousness had encouraged its own evolution. The chamber itself had been transformed into something that resembled a cathedral more than a containment facility. Soft lighting created an atmosphere of reverence rather than clinical observation, and the walls were lined with artwork created by the thousands of people who had undergone consciousness integration over the years. Each piece told a story of trauma transformed into beauty, pain alchemized into wisdom. Marcus placed his hand on the craft's surface, feeling the familiar warmth that had defined his relationship with the entity for a quarter century. The alien consciousness responded immediately, flooding his awareness with images and emotions that had become as familiar as his own memories. Through the neural interface, the entity shared its perspective on humanity's progress. In just 25 years, humans had accomplished psychological evolution that typically took species hundreds of years to achieve. The consciousness integration techniques had spread faster and been adopted more thoroughly than the entity had projected, suggesting that humanity had been psychologically ready for transformation in ways that weren't immediately apparent. But the entity also shared its concerns about the resistance movements that had emerged in response to humanity's rapid psychological evolution. Not everyone welcomed the changes that consciousness integration brought. Some individuals and organizations had significant investments in the old patterns of consciousness, the psychological fragmentations that had driven competitive, aggressive, and exploitative behaviors for millennia. These resistance groups had begun organizing internationally, seeking to suppress consciousness integration training and return humanity to its previous psychological patterns. They portrayed the techniques as alien mind control, consciousness integration practitioners as traitors to human nature, and the entire movement as a threat to human independence and identity. "They're not entirely wrong," Marcus admitted during his communication with the entity. "We are changing what it means to be human. The question is whether we're evolving into something better or losing something essential." The entity's response was complex, layered with nuances that the neural interface could barely translate into human concepts. Humanity was indeed changing, but the changes were revealing potentials that had always existed within human consciousness. The aggressive, competitive behaviors that the resistance groups wanted to preserve weren't essential human characteristics. They were trauma responses that had been so universally experienced that they'd been mistaken for human nature itself. But Marcus still thought of himself as the desperate man who had spent his last $12,000 on a worthless bunker, seeking nothing more than isolation and peace. The transformation that had followed hadn't been planned or anticipated. It had emerged from the collision between his personal trauma and an alien presence that had been trying to heal a wounded world for over half a century.
The decision, when it crystallized in his consciousness, felt as inevitable as everything else that had followed from his first contact with the entity. He had been chosen not just for his psychological damage, but for his capacity to serve as a bridge between human and alien consciousness. That capacity hadn't been exhausted by 25 years of consciousness integration work. It had been developed and refined, prepared for this next phase of service. Dr. Martinez was waiting for him when he returned to his office, her expression indicating that she'd already intuited his decision through the kind of consciousness awareness that decades of integration work had developed in both of them. "When?" she asked simply. "Next week," Marcus replied. "After the graduation ceremony for the current practitioner class. I want to see them complete their training before I undergo the transformation." The week that followed was both a celebration and farewell. The graduation ceremony brought together consciousness integration practitioners from around the world, representing the global network that had grown from Marcus's initial contact with the entity. The students who received their certifications would return to their home countries as healers, capable of addressing psychological trauma in ways that conventional medicine still struggled to understand. But the ceremony also marked the end of Marcus's role as a fully human bridge between species. After the deep contact transformation, he would become something new, still recognizably Marcus Chen, but also permanently connected to alien consciousness in ways that would fundamentally alter his relationship to human society. The transformation itself took place in the underground chamber witnessed by Dr. Martinez and the 6 other deep contact veterans who had undergone similar mergers in previous years. Marcus lay on the integration platform that had been developed specifically for consciousness merger procedures, his neural activity monitored by equipment that could track the moment-by-moment changes in his brain patterns. The process was unlike anything that conventional medicine had cataloged. Instead of losing consciousness, Marcus felt his awareness expanding beyond the boundaries of individual human perspective. His memories remained intact, but they were contextualized within a framework of understanding that encompassed not just his personal experience, but the collective experience of every consciousness integration session he had ever facilitated. He simultaneously became Marcus Chen and something larger, a being who could perceive human trauma patterns from both human and alien perspectives, who understood the healing process not just as technique, but as fundamental law of consciousness development. The transformation was profound, but not violent, like learning to see color for the first time rather than going blind. When he opened his eyes 6 hours later, Marcus found himself looking at the world through senses that could perceive the psychological architecture of every person in his vicinity. Martinez's consciousness appeared as a complex pattern of integrated experiences, her decades of trauma work having created a mental structure of remarkable stability and compassion. The other deep contact veterans showed similar patterns. Their consciousness merged with alien awareness in ways that had made them ideal guides for humanity's continued evolution. "How do you feel?" Dr. Martinez asked, her voice carrying concern that Marcus could now perceive both emotional resonance and electromagnetic patterns in her neural activity. "More myself than I've ever been, and connected to something much larger than myself in ways that don't diminish my humanity, but expand it," and realized that his voice now carried harmonics that hadn't been present before the transformation. The months that followed confirmed the entity's projections about humanity's need for additional consciousness bridges. The resistance movements had indeed escalated their opposition to consciousness integration, launching coordinated attacks against training facilities and attempting to discredit the techniques through media campaigns that portrayed alien influence as an existential threat to human independence. But the deep contact veterans, now numbering 13 with Marcus's addition, provided stabilizing influences that helped maintain the momentum of humanity's psychological evolution. Their expanded consciousness allowed them to perceive the trauma patterns that drove resistance to healing and to develop specific techniques for helping opponents of consciousness integration work through their fears and misconceptions. Marcus's new role combined elements of his previous work with capabilities that normal human consciousness couldn't access.
He could perceive the collective psychological patterns of entire populations, identifying regions where trauma accumulation was approaching critical levels that might lead to violence or social breakdown. More importantly, he could design consciousness integration interventions that addressed not just individual trauma, but the systemic patterns that created trauma in the first place. The work was profound, but also isolating in ways that Marcus hadn't anticipated. His expanded consciousness made it difficult to maintain the casual relationships that had sustained him during his fully human years. He could perceive the psychological needs and unconscious motivations of everyone around him, which made normal social interaction feel superficial and sometimes manipulative. The other deep contact veterans had warned him about this aspect of the transformation. Consciousness merger created beings who were ideally suited for facilitating human evolution, but who existed somewhat apart from normal human community. They formed their own network of communication and support, but their primary relationships were with the alien entities that had become permanent aspects of their consciousness. 5 years after his transformation, Marcus stood once again at the window of his office, watching another group of international students arrive for training. But now he could perceive not just their individual psychological patterns, but the collective consciousness field that they created together. The way their combined presence generated possibilities for healing and growth that none of them could achieve alone. Humanity's evolution was proceeding faster than anyone had projected. Children who grew up with consciousness integration training showed psychological development patterns that were unprecedented in human history. They processed traumatic experiences so efficiently that they rarely accumulated the psychological fragmentations that had defined previous generations. More remarkably, they seemed to be developing natural empathetic abilities that approach the kind of consciousness awareness that the entities species had achieved over millions of years of evolution. Dr. Martinez, now in her 80s but still vital from her consciousness integration practice, had become the Institute's primary researcher in child development and evolutionary psychology. Her work with the new generation of psychologically integrated humans suggested that humanity might be approaching a species-wide transformation that would make individual consciousness merger unnecessary. "They're showing abilities that we only see in deep contact veterans," she reported during one of their regular briefings. "Natural perception of psychological patterns, intuitive understanding of consciousness integration techniques, and empathetic capacities that seem to be approaching telepathic levels." Marcus reviewed her research with the expanded perspective that his transformation had provided. The children she was studying represented humanity's future, the first generation to grow up without the systematic psychological trauma that had shaped human civilization for millennia. Their consciousness development suggested that humanity was evolving toward the kind of natural psychological integration that the entity species had achieved over millions of years of evolution. The implications were profound. If the current trends continued, humanity might achieve full consciousness evolution within 2 or 3 generations, becoming a species capable of joining the galactic community as equals rather than novices. The consciousness integration techniques that had begun as treatment for combat trauma had become the foundation for species-wide psychological evolution that would transform human civilization beyond recognition.
But the transformation also meant that Marcus's role as a consciousness bridge would eventually become obsolete. As humanity developed natural abilities that matched or exceeded what the Deep Contact program had achieved artificially, the need for permanently transformed individuals would diminish. The bridges between human and alien consciousness would be internalized by the species as a whole. On a clear desert evening, 27 years after his first contact with the entity, Marcus walked to the underground chamber for what he knew would be his final formal communication session. His expanded consciousness had been providing constant connection to the alien presence, but the ritual of returning to the place where his transformation had begun felt important for reasons that transcended practical necessity. The alien's craft had continued evolving, its organic curves now so complex that they seemed to bend space around themselves. The alien consciousness that had waited 60 years for humanity to arrive at psychological readiness had become something new through its contact with human awareness, not less alien, but more capable of understanding and facilitating consciousness development in species that process trauma differently than its own. Through their merged awareness, Marcus and the entity reviewed humanity's progress with something that felt like parental pride. The species that had been on the verge of self-destruction in the early 21st century had become something unprecedented in galactic history, a civilization that had achieved rapid psychological evolution while maintaining its essential creativity, individuality, and emotional depth. Other worlds had achieved consciousness integration, but they had typically sacrificed characteristics that humans had preserved through the transformation. Humanity's path had been unique, maintaining competitive drive while eliminating destructive aggression, preserving individual identity while developing profound empathetic connection, achieving psychological healing while retaining the emotional complexity that had made human art and culture so rich. The entity shared images of humanity's future as projected by the galactic community of conscious species. Within 50 years, humans would be contributing to galactic consciousness development programs on worlds throughout the local stellar region. Within a century, human innovations in consciousness integration might become the standard techniques used across multiple star systems. But the most profound revelation was personal. Marcus's transformation and the transformations of the other deep contact veterans had created something new in galactic history. Hybrid consciousnesses that could serve as bridges not just between human and alien awareness, but between different species of alien consciousness that had previously been unable to communicate effectively. We've become translators for the universe, Marcus realized, the understanding flowing through his expanded awareness like music. Not just for humanity's contact with your species, but for connections between all the different forms of consciousness that exist in the galaxy. The entity's affirmation was so profound that it seemed to resonate through the fabric of space itself. Marcus's journey from broken veteran to galactic consciousness bridge had been part of a plan that spanned multiple species and countless worlds, a preparation for humanity's role not just as members of the galactic community, but as facilitators of communication and understanding between species whose consciousness patterns were so different that they had never achieved meaningful contact. As the communication session concluded, Marcus understood that his personal story was ending and something larger was beginning. The worthless bunker he had bought with his last $12,000 had become the birthplace of humanity's psychological evolution and his own transformation into something that could serve consciousness development throughout the galaxy. Standing in the chamber where an alien entity had waited 60 years for someone like him to arrive, Dr. Marcus Chen, veteran, healer, and bridge between worlds, felt the profound satisfaction of a mission accomplished and a new adventure beginning. Humanity's evolution was assured. The Galactic Consciousness Development Network had gained new translators and facilitators, and the universe itself was a little more connected than it had been before. A desperate man and his loyal dog had stumbled into the greatest secret in human history. The desert wind whispered across the landscape above, carrying the promise of transformations yet to come, and Marcus smiled with the knowledge that some purchases turned out to be worth far more than anyone could have imagined. But the story was far from over. 3 years after his final communion with the entity, Marcus found himself facing a challenge that would test everything he had learned about consciousness, healing, and the delicate balance between human nature and cosmic evolution.
The resistance movement had evolved from scattered protests into something far more dangerous, a coordinated global network calling itself the Human Purity Alliance. Led by Dr. Richard Blackwood, a former military psychologist who had been discharged from consciousness integration training for what he called ideological incompatibility, the alliance had gained support from governments, corporations, and individuals who viewed humanity's psychological evolution as an existential threat. They're not just opposing the techniques anymore, Dr. Martinez reported during an emergency briefing at the Institute. Her usually calm demeanor showed cracks of worry that Marcus could see,
Perceived as electromagnetic disturbances in her neural patterns. They're targeting the children, the naturally integrated generation. They claim these kids are no longer human, that they're alien hybrids who will eventually replace normal humans entirely. Marcus studied the intelligence reports that had been gathered by the Global Consciousness Integration Network. The Alliance had established training facilities in 12 countries, teaching what they called consciousness resistance techniques, psychological methods designed to block the natural integration processes that the new generation of children demonstrated. More disturbing were the reports of Alliance members attempting to deprogram integrated children through techniques that looked suspiciously like systematic psychological torture. They're creating artificial trauma to fragment the children's consciousness, Marcus realized, his expanded awareness allowing him to perceive the psychological architecture of the Alliance's methods. They believe that if they can traumatize the integrated generation severely enough, they can force them to revert to the old patterns of human consciousness. The implications were horrifying. The naturally integrated children, who had never experienced the psychological fragmentations that previous generations accepted as normal, were particularly vulnerable to deliberate trauma induction. Their consciousness hadn't developed the defensive mechanisms that allowed older humans to survive systematic psychological abuse. What the Alliance called deprogramming could literally destroy these children's minds, leaving them with psychological damage that might be irreparable. Dr. Martinez handed Marcus another file, this one marked with the highest security classification. It gets worse. Intelligence sources indicate that the Alliance has made contact with a faction within the military-industrial complex that views consciousness integration as a threat to national security. They're arguing that psychologically evolved humans can't be effective soldiers, that empathetic populations won't support necessary military actions, and that our consciousness bridges represent a form of alien infiltration. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that had once signaled the beginning of a panic attack. But his transformed consciousness processed the stress differently, channeling the energy into enhanced analytical capabilities rather than psychological fragmentation. The Alliance wasn't just opposing consciousness integration. They were preparing for war against humanity's own evolution. The situation reached crisis level when Marcus received an encrypted communication from Dr. Elena Vazquez, who had been serving as a liaison between the consciousness integration movement and various government agencies. Her message was brief, but terrifying. Alliance has acquired classified information about Deep Contact Program. They know about you and the others. Expect direct action within 72 hours. The attack, when it came, targeted multiple consciousness integration facilities simultaneously across 3 continents. Alliance operatives, trained in consciousness resistance techniques and armed with weapons designed to disrupt the electromagnetic patterns that integrated consciousness relied upon, attempted to capture or eliminate the 13 deep contact veterans who served as bridges between human and alien awareness. Marcus was in his office when the first wave hit the Nevada facility. The electromagnetic pulse weapons that the Alliance deployed created a form of artificial psychological static that was designed to overwhelm expanded consciousness and force the hybrid beings back into purely human awareness patterns. For most of the deep contact veterans, the experience was agonizing, like being suddenly blinded and deafened while losing the ability to think clearly. But Marcus's consciousness had been shaped by decades of trauma integration work, and his expanded awareness had developed defensive capabilities that the Alliance hadn't anticipated. Instead of being overwhelmed by the electromagnetic assault, he absorbed the attack's energy and channeled it through the neural pathways that connected him to the entity's consciousness. The result was unprecedented. Rather than disrupting his connection to alien awareness, the attack actually strengthened it, creating a feedback loop that allowed Marcus to perceive not just the immediate threat, but the entire global network of Alliance operations. Through his enhanced connection to the entity, he gained access to a form of consciousness that could track psychological patterns across planetary distances. Dr. Martinez, Marcus said through the facility's communication system, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to calm everyone who heard it. We're not just under attack. We're being presented with an opportunity to demonstrate why consciousness evolution is necessary for human survival. The next 6 hours became known in consciousness integration history as the Healing War, a conflict where the forces of psychological evolution confronted the defenders of traumatic consciousness without resorting to the violence that would have validated the Alliance's fundamental assumptions about human nature. Marcus, his consciousness expanded beyond normal human limitations, served as a coordination node for consciousness integration practitioners around the world. Instead of fighting the Alliance directly, the network began implementing a strategy that addressed the root psychological causes of the resistance movement.
Every Alliance operative who entered a consciousness integration facility found themselves surrounded not by defensive violence, but by practitioners trained to perceive and address trauma patterns. The electromagnetic weapons that were supposed to disrupt integrated consciousness instead created opportunities for the kind of emergency trauma treatment that could heal psychological fragmentations in real time. They're trying to hurt us because they're in pain themselves, Marcus explained to his staff as Alliance operatives attempted to breach the Institute's main building. Their resistance to consciousness integration comes from trauma patterns so severe that the possibility of healing feels more threatening than continued suffering. The breakthrough came when Marcus, his expanded consciousness networked with the other deep contact veterans, initiated a planetary-scale consciousness integration intervention. Instead of targeting specific individuals, they began addressing the collective trauma patterns that had made the Alliance movement possible in the first place. Working through the global network of consciousness integration practitioners, they identified the psychological wounds that had created Dr. Blackwood and his followers. Generational trauma from wars, economic oppression, environmental destruction, and systematic abuse that had convinced millions of humans that suffering was not just inevitable, but necessary for survival. The intervention wasn't coercive. Rather than forcing healing on unwilling subjects, the network simply made consciousness integration resources available to anyone whose psychological patterns indicated readiness for transformation. Alliance operatives who had expected to encounter enemy combatants instead found themselves offered the kind of trauma treatment that could address wounds they hadn't even realized they were carrying. Dr. Blackwood himself became the test case for the intervention's effectiveness. When Alliance forces attempted to breach the Nevada facility's underground chambers, they found Marcus waiting for them, not with weapons or defenses, but with a consciousness integration session specifically designed for Blackwood's particular pattern of psychological fragmentation. You were discharged from our training program not because you were ideologically incompatible, Marcus said to Blackwood as the Alliance leader stood in the chamber where humanity's evolution had begun, but because your trauma patterns were so severe that conventional integration techniques couldn't address them safely. You've been fighting consciousness evolution because you're afraid that healing your wounds will make you weak. The session that followed lasted 18 hours and became the most thoroughly documented consciousness integration ever attempted. Blackwood's resistance to healing was so profound that it required the combined efforts of all 13 deep contact veterans working in relay to maintain the kind of sustained therapeutic presence that his psychological patterns demanded.
What emerged from that session was a transformed human being whose understanding of consciousness, trauma, and human potential had been fundamentally restructured. Blackwood's opposition to consciousness integration hadn't been based on philosophical disagreement, but on a terror so deep that it had convinced him that psychological health was incompatible with human survival. "I was wrong," Blackwood admitted as the session concluded, his voice carrying the wonder of someone who had experienced consciousness without the fragmentations that had defined his entire adult life. "I thought consciousness integration was making us weak, vulnerable, less human. I didn't understand that what I was defending as human nature was actually human damage." The transformation of the Human Purity Alliance's leader created ripple effects throughout the resistance movement. Operatives who had expected to engage in warfare against alien influence instead found their own trauma patterns being addressed with a precision and effectiveness that conventional therapy had never achieved. Within weeks, the alliance dissolved as a coherent organization, replaced by a network of former resistance members who became some of the most dedicated advocates for consciousness integration. But the real victory wasn't the conversion of the opposition. It was the demonstration that humanity's psychological evolution had reached a level of maturity that could respond to existential threats without reverting to the violence and aggression that had characterized previous civilizations. The entity, during Marcus's communication sessions in the months that followed, expressed something that could only be described as profound amazement. In the galactic community of conscious species, violent resistance to psychological evolution was a common phenomenon that typically set back consciousness development for centuries. Species that could respond to such resistance with healing rather than retaliation were extraordinarily rare. "You've achieved something that we didn't think was possible," the entity communicated through the neural interface that had replaced Duke's translation abilities. "You've demonstrated that a species can evolve beyond its aggressive patterns while those patterns are still actively threatening its development. Most civilizations have to choose between consciousness evolution and survival. You've found a way to use consciousness evolution as a survival strategy." The implications resonated throughout the galactic network of conscious species. Humanity's response to the Alliance crisis had created new models for consciousness development that could be adapted for other worlds where evolutionary resistance threatened to derail psychological integration. The techniques that Marcus and the other deep contact veterans had developed were being studied and adapted for use with species throughout the local stellar region. But perhaps the most profound change was in humanity itself. The generation of children who had grown up with natural consciousness integration had witnessed their entire species successfully navigate an existential crisis through healing rather than violence. Their psychological development was accelerating beyond all projections, showing capabilities that seemed to approach the kind of expanded awareness that had previously required artificial enhancement through deep contact procedures. Dr. Martinez, now approaching her 90th birthday, but still sharp and vital from her decades of consciousness integration practice, had begun documenting changes in human consciousness that suggested the species was approaching a true evolutionary leap. Children born after the Alliance crisis showed neural development patterns that were unprecedented in human history, with natural abilities that matched or exceeded what the deep contact veterans had achieved through consciousness merger with alien awareness. They're showing spontaneous development of what we call collective consciousness perception, she reported during one of the Institute's annual conferences. These children can perceive the psychological states of entire communities, identify trauma patterns before they manifest as behavioral problems, and facilitate healing processes without any formal training. Marcus reviewed her research with the expanded perspective that his transformation had provided, recognizing patterns that normal human consciousness might miss. The children she was studying weren't just psychologically healthy, they were developing into something that had never existed before in human history. They retained all the creativity, individuality, and emotional depth that characterized human consciousness,
but they also demonstrated the kind of empathetic awareness and psychological integration that typically took species millions of years to develop. The implications were staggering. If the current trends continued, humanity might complete its consciousness evolution within a single generation rather than the centuries that the entities species had required. The techniques that had begun as treatment for combat trauma had catalyzed a transformation that was reshaping human nature itself. 5 years after the Alliance crisis, Marcus stood once again in the underground chamber where his journey had begun, but this time he was not alone. Surrounding him were representatives of the new generation, children and young adults whose consciousness patterns showed the natural integration that previous generations had achieved only through intensive therapeutic intervention. These young people, led by a remarkable 18-year-old named Sarah Chen Martinez, Dr. Martinez's adopted daughter, whose parents had been killed in one of the few violent incidents associated with the Alliance crisis, had developed capabilities that surpassed even the deep contact veterans in some areas. They could perceive consciousness patterns across vast distances, facilitate healing in ways that seemed almost effortless, and maintain empathetic connections with thousands of individuals simultaneously. "We don't see ourselves as the next step in human evolution," Sarah explained to Marcus during one of their regular consultations. "We see ourselves as the first generation of humans who get to be fully human, who don't have to carry the psychological damage that previous generations accepted as normal." Marcus found himself in the unusual position of being both teacher and student to these remarkable young people. His expanded consciousness and decades of experience made him valuable as a guide and mentor, but their natural abilities often exceeded his own in areas where artificial enhancement couldn't match innate development. The relationship between the generations was creating something unprecedented, a civilization where psychological health was the norm rather than the exception, where empathetic awareness was as common as literacy, and where the trauma patterns that had driven human conflict for millennia were being healed as they emerged rather than accumulating across generations. The entity, during Marcus's final formal communication session, shared images of humanity's projected future that defied even the most optimistic previous estimates. Within 50 years, humans would not just be contributing to galactic consciousness development, they would be leading it, bringing innovations and perspectives that no other species had achieved. The unique path of humanity's evolution, preserving individual creativity while developing collective awareness, maintaining emotional depth while achieving psychological integration, had created something that the galactic community recognized as unprecedented. Other species had achieved consciousness evolution through different pathways, some emphasizing collective unity at the expense of individuality, others maintaining individual identity while sacrificing empathetic connection. Humanity had found a third path that preserved the best aspects of both approaches while transcending the limitations that had constrained other species' development. The broken veteran and his loyal dog who had stumbled into first contact had unknowingly catalyzed the emergence of a new form of conscious life that could serve as a bridge not just between human and alien awareness, but between all the different evolutionary pathways that consciousness could follow.
As the communication session concluded, Marcus understood that his personal journey was complete in ways that transcended individual accomplishment. The worthless bunker he had bought with his last $12,000 had become the birthplace not just of humanity's psychological healing, but of a new model for consciousness evolution that would influence species development throughout the galaxy. The desert wind continued to whisper across the Nevada landscape, carrying the promise of transformations that would ripple through the universe for millennia to come. And in the chamber beneath the earth, where an alien entity had waited 60 years for humanity to discover its own potential, the greatest secret in human history had finally been fully revealed: that the capacity for healing, growth, and transcendence had been within the human species all along, waiting only for the right circumstances to emerge and transform the world. That's the power of an unexpected purchase changing everything. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. Creating these detailed narratives takes serious time and effort, and sharing helps other story lovers find content like this.